Okay, hello, welcome to Lecture 8, Cardiovascular Physiology. Before we get going, there are two documents up on Blackboard that hopefully you all saw. One is a blank heart diagram and one is the blank circulatory diagram. I'd like you to just go through before you start this PowerPoint and take the notes, just to go see what you remember here and label this heart diagram. What do you see, just match the letters to the structure over here and see what you remember from A&P2 and general gross anatomy. I'd like you to also do that same thing with this circulatory diagram. Okay, I'd like to see where you're all at, and knowing these ahead of time and refreshing yourself on these structures are going to help you greatly next to the next few lectures. So there's certain things I'm going to be talking about, especially when we get into myocardial physiology, peripheral hemodynamics, that if you can't picture the circulatory system or the anatomical parts that I'm talking about, then it may be a little bit more difficult. So I'd like you to just do a quick review of this anatomy before we get started. Okay, so now that we've talked about that, let's hop into the lecture for today. So right now we're going to go over a brief introduction to the cardiovascular system, then we will hop a little bit into electrophysiology and then central and peripheral hemodynamics. So when we talk about the cardiovascular system, we are talking about the heart and the vessels and the vasculature, which branches systemically. The heart is a two-sided pump. There's a right pump and a left pump. I want you to think of the heart as two sides since they both function a little differently. Okay. The right side of the heart pumps blood to the pulmonic system, and the left side of the heart pumps blood systemically. So the left side of the heart is much more pressurized, whereas the right side of the heart is a low pressure system. So over here, we have the left side of the heart, and then we have the right side of the heart over here. So the right side of the heart pumps blood to the lungs, which is the pulmonary system, and then the left side pumps everywhere else through the aorta, all its branches, it's pumped systemically. So naturally, we can understand how the left side of the heart has to be a high pressure system because it's going to every other organ and vessel in the body, compared to the right side of the heart. Its only main function is to pump blood and receive blood from the lungs. All right, so hopefully you all did test your knowledge a bit before starting this lecture. And so let's just go through some of these structures really quick, even though you can see it here. Right, so we have our left ventricle, we have our left atrium, our right atrium, and our right ventricle. Those are our four chambers of the heart, right? So our receiving chambers of the heart are the atriums, right? So blood coming back to the heart gets shoveled into the atriums. Then we go down through the valves into the ventricles before we pump it back out either into pulmonic or to systemic circulation, right? So our aorta is the one that's coming out of this left ventricle here, right? Our aortic semilunar valve is the one that closes this off. And then we have our pulmonary veins over here. We have our right ventricle tricuspid valve, our pulmonary valve, which is here, which then blocks the right atrium and opens so we can pump into the lungs. And then we have our superior and inferior vena cavas, right? So this is where the blood returning from the lungs comes back in through these vena cavas back into this right atrium, okay? Right. So just to correct what I just said there, actually the blood is coming back systemically, right? Because that's going to be blood that we dropped off all that oxygen. So blood's going to come back in from the systemic circulation into the right side of the heart. Why? Because then we need to pump this blood to the lungs in order to go pick up more oxygen. And then we're going to return to the left side of the heart so then we can pump that oxygenated blood into the systemic system. Just wanted to make that clarification. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about heart valves in general. We have valves which keep unidirectional flow through the heart. This means that they prevent backflow of blood through our system, which, right, we don't want blood to go backwards. We want it to go, it's a one-way system. So our mitral valve and tricuspid valve control blood moving from the atria to the ventricles. Okay, so we have our tricuspid valve and our mitral valve over here. Okay, so these continue unidirectional flow into the ventricles from the atria, where they're coming in from the pulmonic circulation as well as the systemic circulation, okay? Our aortic semilunar valve, which is right here, controls blood moving from our left ventricle into the aorta, into this big artery right here, right? And then we see the big branches off of the aorta, and then we go systemically over there. So from the left ventricle into the aorta and to the rest of the body, to systemic circulation. Our pulmonic valve controls blood moving from the right ventricle to our pulmonary artery. So right here, pulmonary valve, right ventricle into this pulmonary, into our pulmonary artery. Right, so if we looked at the right diagram over here, this would be more of a transverse section of the heart if we sliced it in half transversely. So we have the chambers here, right? So we have the right and the left chambers where blood would be coming in, and that's the valve that we would be shooting blood downwards. Yeah. So once it comes in, we open. When we want blood to go down, then they shut tight in order to keep unidirectional flow. Same here with the aortic and the pulmonary valve, right? They will open in order for us to eject blood out into the pulmonic or the systemic system, and then they will close tightly to keep unidirectional flow. Okay, so let's talk about papillary muscles for a little bit. Okay, so the key player with regards to keeping unidirectional flow, which allows these valves to open and close, are our papillary muscles, right? Which are actually right there. These are called our papillary muscles, and the chordae tendineae arises off of these papillary muscles and attaches to the valve. Okay, so these muscles pull down on the chordae tendineae to shut the valves tight to maintain unidirectional flow. So the output of the myocardium is pulsatile, right? So we open and close, open and close. It's not smooth flow yet, where it's all nice layers one on top of the other right now, which we'll get into in a little bit. But these are the key players that's actually going to allow, when these contract and relax. When we relax, we're going to allow blood in, and then when we want to shut the valve off, these are going to pull on this chordae tendineae and shut that valve tight. All right, so when we talk about output of the myocardium, it is cyclic or pulsatile, right? So we eject, we relax, we eject, so it's kind of this noisy flow, so to speak. So it's up in a pulsatile fashion. When we're talking about a reference person, when the left side of the heart contracts, it will be at about 120 millimeters of mercury. The afterload in the aorta is about 80 millimeters of mercury. This can actually rise up to 115 millimeters of mercury during high intensity exercise. Okay, so let's talk about the afterload in the aorta. What does that mean? Okay, afterload is the amount of pressure that must be applied to keep the aortic semilunar valve shut while we are filling. So again, we're maintaining unidirectional flow. The afterload is the pressure in which the left ventricle must overcome in order for blood to be ejected systemically. Okay, so let's go back to our diagram to talk about afterload so you can get a good visual. Okay, so I'll repeat it again. Afterload is the amount of pressure that must be applied to keep this aortic semilunar valve shut, right? So we have to have a good amount of pressure that is being applied to this valve in order to keep unidirectional flow. Otherwise, we would have a lot of backflow, back and forth, and all that, right? So average person, it's about 80 millimeters of mercury, okay? So you could also look at it as that afterload is also the pressure that the left ventricle right here must overcome in order to open up the valve and eject blood systemically, right? Because if this is at 80 millimeters of mercury, that's what it keeps it shut during rest, during diastole. So we need to build up pressure in this left side of the ventricle. Why? Because we want to overcome this pressure, so we must go higher than 80 millimeters of mercury in order to open the valve. Otherwise, we wouldn't open it. If this only generated about 65 millimeters of pressure, we wouldn't open this valve and the blood wouldn't be able to be ejected. So we need to increase the pressure on this in the left ventricle here above 80 millimeters of mercury, and boom, open up this, which will allow us to open up this aortic semilunar valve and eject systemically. Okay, so we talked about afterload and preload from a musculoskeletal standpoint as being the length type of tension relationship to do with skeletal muscle tissue, which is totally different than the preload and afterload terms here. So try not to get those confused. Preload and afterload within the heart are very different definitions compared to the musculoskeletal ones we just went over in neuromuscular physiology. All right, so let's talk about now blood flow from the heart to the systemic side of circulation, okay? We're talking about the blood going from the left ventricle through the aorta then to the rest of the body. Okay, so flow goes from the heart in this order. From the heart to the aorta to the large arteries to the arterioles down to the capillaries. Okay, so that's how the branches go. We said that the output of the myocardium is pulsatile. Yet when we get to the capillaries, we want slow, smooth flow. Why do we want slow, smooth flow in the capillaries? This is where gas exchange takes place. So we're going to drop off oxygen and we're going to pick up some waste. For an example, carbon dioxide, right? So if we had a very fast pulsatile type of noisy flow, like what happens when we eject from the heart into those major arteries, it's not enough time. The flow of blood is too fast. It's not enough time for us to exchange those nutrients, right? So that's why we branch, right? And as we branch, we get more branches as we go down. So we go from the arteries to the aorta, from the arteries to the arterioles to the capillaries, and along the way, we will get slower, smoother flow. And by the time we get to those capillaries, that's where we want a very slow, smooth flow because that's where exchange occurs. All right, so we're going to talk about this diagram next with regards to circulation. But before we do, I want to go back to that heart diagram to show you about a couple different things here. Okay, so when we were younger, we probably learned that veins, carry deoxygenated blood and arteries carry oxygenated blood. That is correct for the most part, except two areas in the body, and that's in here in the heart. Okay, so we have our pulmonary artery, right, is actually, look, it is blue. Okay, so that actually means that this is carrying blood with less oxygen or deoxygenated blood, so to speak, but it's an artery, right? And didn't we learn that, all arteries carry oxygenated blood, right? But it doesn't in this case, because when the blood returns from the systemic side of circulation into the vena cavas, into the right atrium, right, we have dropped off a lot of oxygen at the tissue level. So we need to come in and grab that blood that's getting pumped back needs to grab more oxygen. So we're coming into the right atrium, going down to the right ventricle, and it's getting pumped into this pulmonary artery that's going to go to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. All right, so here's an instance where this artery is actually carrying deoxygenated blood, so it doesn't follow that rule that we learned about when we were younger. Okay, it's the same thing with the pulmonary veins, right? So veins, right, so these veins are red, and these pulmonary veins are coming back into this left atrium where the blood is coming into, and it's going to go down to the left ventricle to get pumped out systemically. So these pulmonary veins are returning to the heart with blood that just picked up a bunch of oxygen from the lungs. So this is the other area where this doesn't make sense. These veins are full of oxygen. So instead of thinking of the terms of, oh, all arteries carry oxygenated blood, all veins carry deoxygenated blood, I want you to think of it as this, because this is 100% the fact, either no matter where you are in the body. Veins carry blood back to the heart, and arteries carry blood away from the heart. That will happen 100 out of 100 times everywhere anatomically. Okay, so I would just like you to think of them more as moving systems of veins carry blood back to the heart. So venous side of circulation, we're going back to the heart, where the arterial system, we're going away from the heart, right? So arteries carry blood away from the heart, right? So I just want you to make sure you think of that in case you got confused, that this is that one instance where this pulmonary artery is, so even though this is blue, we are still correct with what I just said with the artery. So is the artery taking blood away from the heart? Correct, it is. So the artery is still taking blood away from the heart. And are these pulmonary veins now, which are rich in oxygen, bringing blood back to the heart? Correct, right? So I would just like you to think of it as arteries take blood away from the heart and veins bring blood back to the heart. Just wanted to make that note before we move on. Okay, so we're going to pick up with this diagram on the next video lecture as well. So we're going to look here just to give a brief summary of how circulation is and why really this heart is a two-sided pump. So we will pick up here on that on the next video continuing this lecture.